Hello everyone. So today I'm going to do the solution architect probable questions that you will see in solution architect associate examination, and as I have mentioned in earlier videos, I will be posting the link for this document in the description below, as well as I'll have a link for the Facebook group where you can ask the question if you have any doubt. So let's go ahead and get started. And by the way, I want to recall that if you haven't watched the earlier two videos, you can go ahead and look through the channel. You'll see the videos over there and some labs that helps you to have good experience and knowledge about AWS services too. Okay, let's go ahead and get started for now. Okay, so it says currently you have a NAT gateway defined for your private instances. You need to make the NAT gateway highly available. How can this be achieved? So when the scenario comes like to make the NAT gateway highly available, right, you need to create a NAT gateway in another availability zone, right? So the next question, it says a company wants to have a fully managed data store in AWS. It should be a compatible MySQL database, which is an application requirement. Which of the following database can be used for this purpose? So we can use Amazon Aurora, which is a fully managed MySQL and PostgreSQL compatible relational database, right? Just you need to understand the question says fully managed data store in AWS, which is compatible with MySQL, right? So this is the best option. Moving towards the next question, we have a solution architect is designing an online shopping application running in VPC on EC2 instances behind an elastic load balancer application. The instances run in an auto-scaling group across multiple availability zones. The application tier must read and write data to a customer database cluster. There should be no access to the database from the internet, but the cluster must be able to obtain software passes from the internet. Which VPC design will meet these requirements? So by that you clearly notice that this line, right, your database should not have access, but the cluster must obtain the software passes. So what you can do is you can do public subnet for the application tier and NAT gateway, and private subnet for the database cluster, right? So moving towards next question, always notice that NAT gateway needs public subnet, right? So moving towards next question, we have a company, right? A company has an application that stores images and thumbnails for images on S3. While the thumbnails images need to be available for downloaded immediately, the images themselves are not accessed that frequently. Which is the most cost efficient storage option to store images that meets the requirements? So always notice some of the key terms. It says not accessed frequently, talking about S3, right? So then the answer will be S3 standard infrequent access, right? So moving towards next question, you have an application hosted on AWS consisting of EC2 instances launched via an auto-scaling group. You notice that the EC2 instances are not scaling up on demand. What checks can be done to ensure that the scaling occurs as expected? So always notice it asks that to scale on demand, what can be done? What checks can be done, right? So you need to have right matrices. That's the answer. Ensure that the right matrices are used to trigger the scale out. If your scaling events are not based on right matrices and do not have right threshold defined, then the scaling will not occur as you want it to happen. So moving towards next question, you have an application hosted in AWS that writes images to S3 bucket. The concurrent number of users on the application is expected to reach around 10,000 and approximately 500 reads and write expected per second. How should the architecture maximize the S3 performance? So this you can do by adding a random string, right? So you should prefix each object with a random string, right? So this adds a randomness to the objects. So if you have request rate which is very high, you need to use the hash keys or random string to the prefix, which is one of the common thing that you need to carry out, which is a part of CloudFront as well. You'll notice the adding the hexadecimal hash, right? So this is one of the important part which you might see in the examination, right? So moving towards next question. A company has a set of EBS volumes that needs to be catered to in case of disaster. How can you achieve this in an efficient manner using the existing AWS service? See, you have an EBS volumes, right? So and it needs to be catered in case of disaster. Always notice that in that scenario, use EBS snapshot to create volume in another region. You can copy, you can you can create the snapshot and you can create the copy of it in another region. That's what it means to say, right? So moving towards next question. Your company currently has a web distribution hosted using the AWS CloudFront services. The IT security department has confirmed that the application using the web distribution now falls under the scope of PCI compliance. Which of the following steps needs to be carried out to ensure that the compliance objectives are met, right? So we have two things that we need to ensure. That is to ensure the CloudFront access logs and to capture requests that are sent to the CloudFront API, right? Why is that? If you run PCI or HIPAA compliant workloads, so the probable question which you'll see is PCI compliance or HIPAA compliant, right? So if you run PCI or HIPAA compliant workloads on AWS shared responsibility model, it is recommended that you log your CloudFront users data for the last 365 days for future audition process. To log the users data, follow above two options, which is to ensure CloudFront access logs and capture requests that are sent to the CloudFront API. Okay, so moving to our next question. Your company has a set of EC2 instances hosted in AWS. There is a mandate to prepare for a disaster and come up with the necessary disaster recovery procedures. Which of the following would help in mitigating the effect of disaster for EC2 instances, right? So one of the disaster recovery solution for EC2 instance is to use the AMIs to recreate the EC2 instance in another region. So as I said, like you can create an AMI from EC2 instances and then copy to another region. In case of disaster, an EC2 instance can be created from the AMI, right? So moving to our next question. A company currently hosts a Redshift cluster in AWS. For security reasons, it should be ensured that all traffic from and to the Redshift cluster doesn't go through the internet. Which of the following feature can be used to fulfill the requirement in efficient manner? So it says, right, the traffic of the Redshift cluster doesn't go through the internet, right? So you can do that by enabling the Redshift enhanced VPC routing, right? So what can be done with enabling the enhanced VPC routing? When you use Amazon Redshift enhanced VPC routing, Amazon Redshift forces all copy and onload traffic between your cluster and your data repositories through your Amazon VPC. If enhanced VPC is not enabled, Amazon Redshift routes traffic through the internet, including traffic to other services with the AWS network. So it clearly says that you must enable the Amazon Redshift VPC routing. If it's not enabled, it will route traffic to the internet, right? But we have requirement for the Redshift cluster to not go through the internet. So for that we need to enable Amazon Redshift enhanced VPC routing. So moving to next question. A company has a set of Hyper-V machines and VMware virtual machine. They are now planning on migrating these instances to AWS cloud. Which of the following can be used to move the resources to AWS cloud? So always notice that you have like virtual machines to move to the AWS cloud. We have the feature called VM import tools. You can import Windows and Linux VMs virtual machines that use VMware ESX or Workstation, Microsoft Hyper-V and Citrix Xen virtualization formats, right? Okay. So you need to notice in here is to use the virtual machine import tools, right? When it comes about importing the virtual machine, right? So moving towards next question. An architecture consists of following, that is a primary and secondary infrastructure hosted in AWS, and both infrastructure comprises of elastic load balancer, auto scaling and EC2 resources. How should Route 53 be configured to ensure proper failover in case of primary infrastructure goes down? So the scenario says that we have primary and secondary infrastructure in AWS. Both has elastic load balancer, auto scaling and EC2 resources. And how can you ensure the failover so that in case primary goes down, right, you have the secondary to cover, right? Then for this you need to configure a failover routing policy. So when you have everything set up, right, for the best solution, you need to, for the failover, you need to configure a failover routing policy. You can create an active passive failover configuration by using failover records, or create a primary and a secondary failover record that have the same name and type, and associate a health check with each, right? This is also the cool feature that you can associate the health check with each, right? So moving towards next question. A company requires to provision test environment in a short duration. Also required is an ability to tear them down easily for cost optimization. How can this be achieved? So you have the test environment for a short duration, right? And how can it be easily done with cost optimization? So it can be done with the use of CloudFormation templates to provision the resource accordingly. So again, AWS CloudFormation provides templates that you can use to create AWS resources and provision them in an orderly and predictable fashion, right? This can be used for creating short-lived environment such as test environment. This you need to think. This is the keyword, right? For the short-lived environment such as test environment, you need to use CloudFormation templates, right? Okay, so let's move towards next question. A company stores its log data in S3 bucket. There is current need to have source capabilities available for the data in S3. How can this be achieved in the efficient and ongoing manner? So this can be achieved by use an AWS Lambda function which gets triggered whenever the data is added to the S3 bucket, and load the data into Amazon Elasticsearch, right? So again, look through the question. It says the company stores the log data in S3 bucket, right? The requirement, the current need is to have the search capabilities available for data in S3, right? So for efficient and ongoing manner, we need to use AWS Lambda function, which gets triggered whenever the data is added to S3, and we can also use that by loading the data in Amazon Elasticsearch. Okay, so what does Elasticsearch provide? AWS Elasticsearch provides full search capabilities and can be used to log files stored in S3 bucket. As you have here, like these are the key points you need to see. It says log data in S3 bucket, right, which a company stores log data in S3 bucket. Then you will know this is the suitable option as well, Amazon Elasticsearch, which helps to store the log files, right, which is used for log files stored in S3 bucket, right? So moving towards next question, we have a company wants to self-manage a database environment. Which of the following should be adopted to fulfill this requirement? Is to create an EC2 instance and database server accordingly. So always notice you are shifting to AWS for self-managed a database environment, right? So what you need to do is you need to create the EC2 instances and then install the database service accordingly. So moving to our next question, a company wants to have a 50 Mbps dedicated connection to its AWS resources. Which of the below services can help fulfill this requirement? So always notice here is also the hint. So you want to have dedicated connection to its AWS resources, then always the option will be direct connect, right? So AWS Direct Connect makes it easy to establish a dedicated network connection from your premises to AWS. Using AWS Direct Connect, you can establish private connectivity between AWS and your data center, office, or the co-location environment, which in many cases can reduce your network cost, increase bandwidth throughput, and provide a more consistent network experience than internet-based connection. So moving to next question, you have a company which is building a two-tier web application to serve dynamic transaction-based content. The data tier uses an online transaction processing database. What should you leverage to enable an elastic and scalable web tier, right? For that you need to do elastic load balancer, and you need to have EC2 instances, and you need to have auto scaling groups, right? Always notice for the data tier, right, which uses online transaction processing, to make it most elastic and scalable, you need to have EC2 instances, and you need to have load balancing among them, as well as auto scaling groups to scale up on demand, right? So moving to our next question, a customer planning on hosting an AWS RDS instance needs to ensure that the underlying data is encrypted. How can this be achieved? So to encrypt the AWS RDS instance, right, you need to ensure the right instance class is chosen for the underlying instance, right? And you need to encrypt the database during creation. So always notice for encryption of AWS RDS instance, you need to ensure the right instance class is chosen for underlying instance, and you need to encrypt the database during creation, right? Encryption for the database can be done during the creation of the database. Also, you need to ensure that the underlying instance type supports DB encryptions. Okay, so moving towards next question. Your operations department is using an incident based application hosted on a set of EC2 instances. These instances are placed behind a auto-scaling group to ensure the right number of instances are in place to support the application. The operations department has expressed dissatisfaction with regard to poor application performance at 9 a.m. every day. However, it is also noticed that the system performance returns to optimal at 9:45. What can be done to ensure that the issue is fixed? So what does it say? At 9 a.m. every day it has poor performance, but after 9:45, right, it returns to optimal performance. Then what you need to do, it has set up the time. So if it has mentioned the exact time, then you need to add a scheduled scaling policy at somewhere before 9 a.m. that's 8:30 a.m. right? So scaling based on a schedule allows you to scale your application in response to predictable load changes, right? So moving towards next question. Your company currently has data hosted in an Amazon Aurora MySQL database. Since this data is critical, there is need to ensure that it is made available in another region in case of disaster. How can this be achieved? So always notice, if you want a disaster recovery for Amazon Aurora MySQL database, you need to create a read replica for the database, right? If you want to create the Aurora MySQL database in another region in case of disaster, right, you need to create a read replica for the database. You can create an Amazon Aurora MySQL DB cluster as read replica in different AWS region than the source DB cluster. Taking this approach can improve your disaster recovery capabilities, let you scale read operation into a region that is closer to your users, and make it easier to migrate from one region to another, right? So moving towards next question, we have a company has a set of EC2 Linux based instances hosted in AWS. There is a need to have a standard file interface for files to be used across all Linux based instances. Which of the following can be used for this purpose? So you need to consider using AWS EFS. So again, notice the hint here. It says standard file interface for the files to be used across Linux based instances. So whenever you hit with something terms which says like file system, right, you need to consider the AWS EFS, right? So moving towards next question. Your company is planning on using Route 53 as the DNS provider. There is a need to ensure that the company's domain name points to an existing CloudFront distribution. How can this be achieved, right? So again, look the question. It says the company is planning to use Route 53 as DNS provider. There is a need to ensure the company's domain name to an existing CloudFront distribution. So how can you ensure the company's domain name to an existing CloudFront distribution? By creating an alias record which points to cloud distribution, right? CloudFront distribution. So for this, to always notice that you need to create an alias record to ensure the company's domain name, right, which points to existing CloudFront distribution, right? So okay, so moving to our next question. A company needs to extend their storage infrastructure to AWS cloud. The storage needs to be available as ISCSI devices for on-premise application servers. Which of the following would be able to fulfill this requirement? So for this, use the AWS storage cached volume service, right? So you might be confused to use the storage gateway or use the cached volumes, right? But here you need to use the AWS storage gateway cached volume service, right? So by using cached volumes, you can use Amazon S3 as your primary data storage while retaining frequently accessed data locally in the storage gateway, right? So this is the scenario where you can be able to use the cached volumes, right? So moving to the next question. Your company has a set of application that makes use of Docker containers, which is used by a development team. There is a need to move these containers to AWS. Which of the following method could be used to set up Docker containers in the separate environment in AWS? So if you have worked with Docker, right, you will clearly identify this elastic beanstalk environment. So always notice to create an elastic beanstalk environment with necessary Docker containers, right? Okay, moving towards next question. A company currently hosts their architecture in US region. They now need to duplicate this architecture to the Europe region and extend the application hosted on this architecture to new region. In order to ensure that users across the globe get the same seamless experience from either setup, what among the following needs to be done? So for this, we need to create a geolocation Route 53 policy to route the policy based on location. So this geolocation Route 53 policy, right, lets you to choose the resources that serve your traffic based on geographic location, right? So whenever it comes to serve the traffic based on geographic location, always notice if the scenario questions comes like choosing the traffic based on geographic location, always create a geographic location Route 53 policy, right? So that's one of the good hint. And moving towards next question. A customer has an instance hosted in AWS public cloud. The VPC and subnet used to host the instances have been created with default setting for the network access control list. An IT administrator needs to be provided with secure access to the underlying instances. How can this be achieved? So to have the secure access to underlying instances, what you need to do is you need to ensure the security group which allows inbound SSH traffic, secure shell traffic from the IT administrator workstation, right? Why is it? Since the security group are stateful, we do not have to configure outbound traffic, right? What enters the inbound traffic is allowed in the outbound traffic too. The default network ACL is configured to allow all traffic to flow in and out of the subnet to which it is associated. since the question does not mention that it is a custom VPC, we would assume that it will be a default one, right? So that we need to ensure that the security group allows the inbound traffic SSH from the IT administrator workstation, right? Okay, moving towards next question. We have a company which has an on-premise infrastructure which they want to extend to the AWS cloud. There is a need to ensure that communication across both environments is possible over the internet. What would you create in this case to fulfill this requirement? So for this, you need to create a VPC connection between on-premise and AWS environment, right? Always notice the scenario question, right? It has says, what does it says is the company has on-premise infrastructure, they want to extend it to AWS cloud, right? So also they need to ensure the communication across both environment is possible over the internet. So for that, you need to create a VPN connection between on-premise and AWS environment. So why not direct connection? See, AWS direct connection between the on-premise and AWS environment is not better option because the question says over the internet. Direct connection does not involve the internet, right? This is the key point. So it says over the internet, but direct connection doesn't involve the internet. So VPN connection is the suitable option, right? So moving towards next question. A company wants to build a brand new application on AWS cloud. They want to ensure that this application follows the microservices architecture. Which of the following services can be used to build this sort of architecture? So notice the key term. It says to ensure the application follows the microservice architecture, right? You have these services like they are AWS Lambda, AWS ECS, which is Elastic Container Service, and AWS API Gateway, which is a serverless component for managing API, for managing access to API, right? Always notice AWS Lambda, ECS, and API Gateway for the application to ensure the microservice architecture, right? So moving towards next question. A CloudFront distribution is being used to distribute content from an S3 bucket. It is required that only a particular set of users get access to certain content. How can this be accomplished? So this can be accomplished by creating a CloudFront with signed URLs and then distribute the URL to the user, right? So again notice the question. So it says the CloudFront distribution is being used to distribute content from the S3 bucket, right? So the next scenario is you need to have particular set of user to get access to certain content, right? So there is some users which need certain content and other which need different content, right? So this can be done with CloudFront signed URL and distributing this URL to the users. So moving towards next question. Your development team wants to start making use of EC2 instances to host their application and web servers. In the space of automation, they want the instances to always download the latest version of the web and application server when they are launched. As an architect, what would you recommend for this scenario? So you need to ask the development team to create scripts which can be added to the users data section when the instance is launched, right? So notice the question, what does it says? It says if you are starting the EC2 instances for hosting the application and web server. So in the space of automation, right, they want to have the instances to download the latest version of web and application server, right? So it can be done only if you create the scripts. So how should you create the script? You should ask the development team to create the scripts which can be added to the users data section when the instance is launched, right? So moving towards next question. Your company has an application that takes care of uploading, processing and publishing videos posted by users. The current architecture for this application includes the following: that is a set of EC2 instances to transfer user uploaded videos to S3 buckets, and a set of EC2 worker processes to process and publish the videos, and an auto scaling group for EC2 worker processes. Which of the following can be added to the architecture to make it more reliable? So the main thing you need to do for these areas for this architecture to make it more reliable is to use the Amazon SQS, which helps in the decoupling of the application. It can store requests to process videos to be picked by worker processes, right? So moving towards next question. You have a business critical 2-tier web application currently deployed in 2 availability zones in a single region using elastic load balancer and auto scaling group. The app depends on synchronous replication at the database layer. The application needs to remain fully available even if one AZ goes offline and if auto scaling cannot launch instances in remaining AZ. How can the current architecture be enhanced to ensure this? So you can do this by deploying 3 availability zones with auto scaling, minimum set to handle 50% peak load per zone, right? If you do that, you will always have 100% availability, right? So even if one goes down, you will have 50 and 50, which makes 100, right? So moving towards next question. You have the following architecture deployed in AWS. That is a set of EC2 instances which sits behind an elastic load balancer and a database hosted in AWS RDS. Of late, the performance on the database has been slacking due to high number of read requests. Which of the following can be added to the architecture to alleviate the performance issue? You notice that the database is slacking due to high number of read requests. So to improve the performance, you can use elastic cache in front of database. So to improve the performance of database, you are adding the elastic cache. So what does it does is elastic cache is the in-memory cache which can be used for caching the common read request so that it helps to improve the performance, right? So moving towards next question. An application is currently hosted in EC2 instances which is attached with EVS volumes. The data on these volumes is frequently accessed, but after a duration of a week, the documents needs to be moved to infrequent access. Which of the following EVS volume type would be cost efficient for the moved document, right? So it talks about the cost efficient option for the moved document. So that would be the cold ESDD because it is one of the most cost efficient solution, right? Okay, moving to our next question. We have a company which is running 3 production web servers that reserved EC2 instances with EBS backed root volumes. These instances have a consistent CPU load of 80%. Traffic is being distributed to these instances by the elastic load balancer. They also have the production and development multi-AZ RDS SQL databases. What recommendation would you make to reduce cost in the environment without affecting the availability of mission critical system? So for this scenario, we need to consider not using multi-RDS deployment for database. Why? Because multi-AZ database are better for production environment rather than for development environment, so that you can reduce cost by not using this for development environment. So always notice that if the scenario comes for production and development environment, it's always better for not using the multi-AZ RDS for development environment. Multi-AZ RDS is only suitable for production environment, right? So moving towards next question, we have an application which consists of couple of EC2 instances. One instance hosts a web application and other instance hosts the database server. Which of the following changes can be made to ensure high availability of the database layer? So we can ensure high availability of database layer by having another EC2 instance in the another availability zone with replication configured, right? So why is that? To ensure high availability, have the EC2 instance in another AZ, so even if one goes down, the other will be available, right? So that's the reason you need to have another EC2 instance in another availability zone with replication configured, right? So moving towards next question, you are designing an architecture on AWS with disaster recovery in mind. Currently, the architecture consists of elastic load balancer and underlying EC2 instances in a primary and secondary region. How can you establish a switchover in case of failure in primary region? So you can do by using Route 53 health check and then do a failover, right? So if you have multiple resources that perform the same function, you can configure DNS failover so that Route 53 will route your traffic from an unhealthy resources to healthy resources, right? So moving towards next question, your company currently has an infrastructure hosted on premise. You have been requested to devise an architecture on AWS for migrating some of the on-premise components. Our current concern is the data storage layer. Minimum administrative overhead are also required for the underlying infrastructure in AWS. Which of the following would be included in your proposed architecture? So for this, you need to use DynamoDB to store data in tables, and you need to use S3 to store the data, right? So for this kind of architecture, you need to have DynamoDB to store the data in tables and use S3 for storing the data, right? Okay, I guess we'll continue this lesson in next part. So hope you enjoyed this video, and see you in next lecture. Thank you.